I would like to welcome Erin Tobin to SLCHA. She drove about 2 hours to get here today, so we're very grateful for that. Erin joined Adirondack Architectural Heritage, also known as AARCH, as Executive Director in 2021. At AARCH, she advances the organization's strategic goals, serves as its Chief Operations and Finance Officer, as well as the primary spokesperson and point of contact for special projects and preservation advocacy efforts. And if that wasn't enough, Erin also oversees AARCH's robust preservation services and educational programs, and she'll be talking a lot more about that work today. Prior to AARCH, Erin served as the Preservation League of New York's Vice President for Policy and Preservation from 2007 to 2021. She's also held positions with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, New York Landmarks Conservancy, and the Historic Albany Foundation. She serves on the City of Albany Historic Resources Commission, appointed in August of 2018, and currently splits her time between Albany and the Adirondacks. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Erin Tobin.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Carlene, and the St. Lawrence County Historical Association for inviting me here this afternoon. It's now afternoon. And I'm delighted to be here. Hello to those of you who are on Zoom. And I'm excited to share a bit about AARCH, our organization. And before I start, I see Chris, one of our board members in the audience. So I know what you're going to say to this, but how many people in the audience know about AARCH already, have heard about Adirondack Architectural Heritage? Fantastic. Any of you members of AARCH? Yeah. Chris, thank you. So maybe this afternoon's talk will entice you to join us, but at the very least, you can learn a little bit about us. And let's see. Oops, I skipped over. There we go. And if you want to learn more about us too, there's a couple copies of our year in review. So you can have, I didn't print out too many, but you can see that after the presentation. So AARCH was founded in 1990 with a mission to promote better public understanding, appreciation, and stewardship of the Adirondacks' unique and diverse architectural heritage. Our full-time staff of 5, which is not shown there. Let's see. There we go. Our full-time staff of 5, shown here in front of the main door of the lodge at Great Camp Sagamore, are based in our Keysville office. Wilkes Jordan in the middle, and I split our time. Wilkes is our Camp Santanoni historic site manager, and I'll be talking a bit about Camp Santanoni this afternoon. She lives in Long Lake and splits her time between home and our office. And then as mentioned, I live in Albany and split my time between there and the Adirondacks. I've got 2 kids still at home in high school down in Albany. So the remaining staff, Samantha Johnson is our membership and communications director. So if you ever call AARCH or come to one of our events, she's the person at the desk or answering the phone usually. Christine Bush is our preservation services director, and she just completed a National Register nomination for the St. Lawrence County Government Center. So she knows Campton well. And then Nolan Cool at the end there is our educational programs director, and he runs our extensive educational tour program and is a public historian. Our building in Keysville on Main Street, so we're in the hamlet of Keysville, right on the border in Clinton County, straddling Clinton and Essex counties, about 20 minutes south of Plattsburgh. And how many of you know Keysville? All right, it's always interesting to me how, who has a Keysville connection, because sometimes it's like this very so.
I got grandson named Keys for whom the village was named.
Oh yes, yeah, the Keys, and there's Keys properties in Peru, and
I had ancestors that were married in Peru.
Nice. Wow. Well, see, all roads lead to Keysville in so many ways. It's remarkable. Wherever I am in New York State, I feel like somebody has a Keysville connection for such a small community. So this is our building, built in around 1849 as the offices of the Eagle Horse-Nail Company, which later became the Sable Horse-Nail Company, and you can see the historic image there. And that might be the very same one that's on the table there that Carlene pulled. Okay. And it was the Sable Horse-Nail Company from 1864 to 1923. And the river is directly to the left of these pictures, the Sable River. And behind our office building is a stone mill that was built around the same time. And it makes these two buildings together kind of a rare survivor of mid-19th century water-powered industrial buildings. And at one point, Keysville, as we said, all roads lead to Keysville. It was a big industrial center in the 19th century and early 20th century. But our service area covers 13 counties. It covers the entire Adirondack Park, as well as the counties with that have land within the Adirondack Park. So all of St. Lawrence and Franklin and Clinton and Warren counties, for example. Washington, all of Washington County, all the counties with some land in the park. So, and we work to preserve the region's architecture and communities. So I'm just going to change my speaker view here a little bit. Through partnership and collaboration in education, action, and advocacy. And these are some photos that I'm going to get more into what we do, but these are some photos that represent the ways in which we fulfill our mission through the educational tours and programs that I mentioned. And you can see, let's see if I put my cursor here, can you see it? No. This is us. The upper right corner for those in Zoom is a tour of Camp Gabriel's in Franklin County, the closed carceral facility that began as a tuberculosis sanatorium. Through hands-on technical workshops, you see Kurt Riegel, who restores historic wood windows. That's one of our historic wood window workshops where we do hands-on learning of how to fix windows, something the Historical Association is going to do here, and about preserving and interpreting Great Camp Santanoni in Newcomb, which that's a drawing of Great Camp Santanoni below. As well as writing National Register nominations, and you all might recognize Malone there in the picture, and supporting other kinds of cultural resource surveys and working with historic property owners. And there's a barn that you can see where we've provided technical assistance. So I'm going to talk more about all of these things, but I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into Camp Santanoni, and I'll do another. How many of you have been to Camp Santanoni in Newcomb?
Thank you.
All right, yes. So Camp Santanoni in Newcomb was built by and for Robert and Anna Prine from Albany. The Prines lived on Willett Street in downtown Albany, overlooking Albany's Washington Park, in a house designed by architects who included the architect Robert Robertson. Architect Robert Robertson, not shown here, but this is the house on Willett Street that his firm designed, and there's a picture of Robert and Anna, was college friends with Robert Prine, and he had family connections to Newcomb, and he designed the main building at Camp Santanoni. That here is a book plate from the Prine era of obviously Camp Santanoni, and it's now, we have a t-shirt that has that book plate on it. So here's a picture of the front of the camp, which the front of course faces the lake, and it's shown here from the very edge of Newcomb Lake, and it welcomed its first guests in 1893. And is one of the earliest examples of what became known as an Adirondack Great Camp. At Camp Santanoni's height, it had over 45 buildings. And these buildings stretch along a 4.8 mile long road called Newcomb Lake Road, which is closed to motor vehicles. It's basically a wide carriage path that you can traverse on a horse-drawn wagon or bicycle or walk in the winter. If there is snow, you can snowshoe or cross-country ski in, but no motorized vehicles because it's inside of the Adirondack Forest Preserve. And that this map here is the entirety of the Santanoni Preserve, which was nearly 13,000 acres that the Prines owned in Newcomb at the height of the land that they owned. Now that entire 13,000 acres is part of the Forest Preserve, and only a 32-acre sliver of that is what's known as a historic area. And that's how the buildings are able to remain there, because of course, with the Forever Wild, maintaining buildings is not part of the Forever Wild philosophy. So this closer view shows that 32-acre Camp Santanoni historic area, and you can see it's outlined in green, and then there's sort of a box around the buildings and where it's situated in relation to New York State Route 28N and the center of Newcomb, the thriving metropolis of Newcomb, as it was. And the main camp complex you see there, if you can read that, I wish I had a pointer right there. And for those on the screen, it's up in the upper section of the slide, is like, as I said, almost 5 miles from 28N, and it overlooks Newcomb Lake, and it was the first part of the Great Camp that was built by the Prines. The Great Camp also includes a gate lodge complex, and that's down at the bottom of the screen. That's where you can drive in, and that where the parking lot is, and is really the entrance to the preserve. And 1 mile in from the gate lodge complex on that path is the farm complex, which was an early 20th century model farm. This is the layout of that main camp at Santanoni. You can see in typical Adirondack Great Camp style, it's a series of pavilions. These pavilions are linked by one overarching roof and a 5,000 square foot porch. So the porch itself is 5,000 square feet at Camp Santanoni. And that is really a part of the whole philosophy of Robert and Anna Prine. Anna loved the outdoors and wanted to be outdoors. And you'll see in a couple slides, they really lived their life outdoors and believed in that connection to nature, as is with many of the other great camps. More than 1,500 spruce trees were logged from the immediate area, from outside the immediate area of the main camp. So they wanted to keep some of the trees, and you see there's still some trees in place to preserve the site's natural surroundings. So they went a little bit outside of where that main camp complex is to log the spruce for the building. And you can see it's log construction. The spruce logs did not keep their bark. They were stripped of bark at Camp Santanoni, unlike some of the other great camps you might visit that still have the bark on the logs. And it gives the building that more finished appearance than camps like Camp Pine Knot over in Racket Lake, for example, and other earlier Adirondack great camps. This is a picture of the Prines and their friends on the porch. You can see Newcomb Lake in the background. They're so eager to enjoy Camp Santanoni and Newcomb Lake that they came out for their first spring party, even as construction continued around them. And we're lucky to have a nice collection of historic photos of the Great Camp. And then the main hall, when you come into to Camp Santanoni and you go into the building, because it's part of the Forest Preserve and AARCH, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, we were formed in 1990. Part of our mission when we were formed and why we were formed was to save Great Camp Santanoni. That was a core piece of our founding. And so even though this is owned and run by the state and the Department of Environmental Conservation, we are the nonprofit Friends Group, essentially, who interpret and steward and lead the restoration projects for this great camp. So when you enter, it's not furnished. It's a shell, essentially, that we keep open. So in the summer, you can come in and walk around at any time. And you can enter from the primary door overlooking the lake or from 2 side doors. And that massive freestanding stone chimney you see has back-to-back fireplaces that anchor that primary main hall. And it kind of supports the structure almost like a tent pole would. And here you can see, these are photos from the prime days, how that front room was used. And then you can also, this is a nice picture of the birch bark on the walls that up above the windows, and that birch bark is still there. And it has this lovely reflective quality. So when the light comes in off the lake in the afternoon, it lights up the room because of the birch bark. And part of what AARCH has done over the 34 years we've been involved is work to make sure that birch bark is intact and conserved. And then the rear part of the this great hall room had a dining area with a library and den over by the stairs. Many of these furnishings are, some are at the Adirondack Experience Museum, some are at the Historical Society in Newcomb. And here's another picture of that main hall. Again, I'm taking this with my back to the lake, and you get an image of the birch bark that's still there. And here's that porch, again, in the primary era, and you can see how it's set up for outside living. And that it's really a space where the Prines and their guests spent their time. And then today, there's a Prine era photo of sitting and lounging kind of on the outside of the railing of the porch. But the view over Newcomb Lake, along with the breeze that comes off the lake, draws people to this porch to read, relax, gather, then and now. And this picture in the bottom is actually a bunch of our friends, personal friends, who we walked into the great camp and had a delicious picnic lunch on the porch. And it's like a magnet that draws you in. And so when you go into the site, you can, those picnic tables are still there. There's Adirondack chairs on the porch where you can sit and relax and look out on the lake. Those are really the only furnishings that are there. And the breeze that comes off the lake blows away a lot of the black flies and mosquitoes that you might find elsewhere in the Adirondacks. So the farm, if you stop there, you're going to get bit. But if you're out at Newcomb Lake, the breeze comes in that keeps them at bay. So the farm complex, which is I mentioned only a mile in from the Gate Lodge. So this is the first thing, what we just looked at was 5 miles out. And that was what Robert Prine first purchased when he bought land in Newcomb to construct this great camp. And he worked kind of from farther out coming in. So he bought land up along Newcomb Lake Road, the road that you take to go into Camp Santanoni, the one that's now in the Forest Preserve where you're walking or on the wagon, was a public road. It was part of the town of Newcomb. There were farms along the road, and there were hunting camps and other things. And so he bought the land for the main camp at the lake and then gradually worked backwards, acquiring land, including for this farm. And this is a picture, a historic image of the farm standing up on the hill looking down over the valley. The barn that you see there is burned 20 years ago, but the other buildings still remain. And this is one of the oldest buildings on the campus of Camp Santanoni. It was a historic farmhouse that now is kind of set back at the farm. As he continued to buy the parcels and construct housing for the farm workers and the gardeners and the herdsmen. So all of this land was purchased in the spring of 1896. So the main camp was built in 1893, and then this land was purchased 3 years later, and that gave him the Robert Prine the opportunity to fully develop this farm complex. And through the development of the farm, Camp Santanoni was one of the only relatively self-sufficient great camps. Edward Burnett, who is a noted gentleman's farm developer, worked with Robert Prine on developing the barn that you can see here, and this dairy building that still exists across the street. So when you're walking out on Newcomb Lake Road towards the main camp, you come onto the clearing, you're in the woods, you come onto a clearing with the farm complex. On your right would have been the barn that now is just foundation ruins. But on the left, there's still the collection of buildings that includes this creamery, which looks as it does today, as it does then. It's just that the woods have encroached a little bit more. This dairy building, which is one of my favorite buildings on the entire complex, was built in 1904 as the centerpiece of the farm complex. It was believed that New York City architects Delano and Aldrich, which were a pretty well-known New York City architectural firm, designed this building because they were working on other Santanoni projects at the time, including the Gate Lodge. And at a time when tuberculosis and influenza were infecting hundreds of thousands of people, this Santanoni dairy provided safe milk and dairy products to the Prines and their guests, and also for the Newcomb community. So there's still some of the Santanoni milk bottles that circulate in the town of Newcomb that have the Santanoni label on them in raised letters. Similarly, this sweet little stone smokehouse tucked into the woods in this farm complex also produced Santanoni bacon. You can see the tag for the Santanoni bacon there. This smokehouse, when you walk into it, you can still sort of smell the faint smell of smoke kind of coming out of the walls. And this building is the farm manager's cottage. It's the youngest building in the Santanoni complex, not counting the DEC shop next to the parking lot, built in 1919. And it was built as a prefabricated house from the Sears catalog, following the design and floor plan of the Harris home that you can see right here. And so the farm manager's cottage, when you come out to the farm, it's up on the hill. It's this sweet little red cottage. That picture there on the left is the farm manager's cottage as it looked on the farm when it was still an active farm. And again, if you go there today, you can see remnants of the stairs, you can see remnants of the stone walls, but given that this is in the forest preserve, we don't do much more other than mow the lawn to keep the trees from growing on this farm complex area. You know, there's, again, because we're abiding by the state forest preserve regulations, we're not doing extensive landscaping or reconstructing. So again, I kind of went from all the way out and working back in, as Robert Prine did when he acquired the land. And this is the Gate Lodge complex. So this is the complex that you see when you first drive in off of 28N. You cross a bridge. It's not this bridge anymore. That connects to Lake Harris, which is the lake that's right in Newcomb. And you can see the Gate Lodge here on the right. And Robert Prine designed that and a gate to keep his complex private. And what's fun about this photo is you can see the way the road curves around here. So the way the road went historically, you went across the river, this little stream, and then you turned right and went under that arch that you can see. And then you swung back around up the hill. So it was sort of like an S curve up the hill to get into Newcomb Lake, to Newcomb Lake Road. Today, if you cross this bridge, you would just go straight up the hill. So you sort of bypass the Gate Lodge and you can see the rise kind of just beyond the bridge. Now there's a parking lot there, and that's where you would park. So this Gate Lodge, this is a Delano and Aldrich rendering of the Gate Lodge complex, which was built pretty close to this. It's not quite exactly, but pretty close, and was completed in 1905. So this is a lovely watercolor ink wash rendition. And as I said, the road wound underneath that main arch before continuing up the farm and the main camp. So then in 1953, so the Prynes owned Camp Santanoni, and I have a version of this talk that Camp Santanoni itself could take an hour and even longer to give a full presentation on, but I wanted to hit the highlights here. So, so moving through the Pryne era, Robert and Anna, they bought it and built it 1893 through the last building on the campus, 1919, that farm manager's cottage. Robert and Anna get older, they pass away, their children, some of them continue to spend time at Camp Santanoni, some don't. So after a period of decline, where it was ultimately operated by a family trust, in 1953, the property was sold to Crandall and Myron Melvin from Syracuse. The Melvins were a prominent Syracuse family, a banker and a lawyer, respectively, and the Melvins owned Santanoni for the following 20 years. During this time, we have relatively few photos. John Melvin, a son, who was a boy when they owned Camp Santanoni. I met him and he has some photos, family photos, but it's close enough to now that they kind of understandably maybe want to hold on to their family photos. It's different when you're like 4 generations removed. When you're 1 generation removed, they appropriately might want to wait a little bit before sharing a lot of, personal family memorabilia. So the Melvins undertook a number of repairs to the Santanoni building. So if you can imagine the Prynes, it fell to the children, and then there was this trust, and they didn't really maintain the camp very much. So the Melvins are really responsible for why we have Camp Santanoni still today, because they did a lot of work just fixing up and kind of mothballing some of the buildings. If you can imagine, the Prynes had this massive staff. The Melvins were a little bit different, clearly a well-off family, but they didn't necessarily use all the buildings in the same way, but they maintained them and appreciated them. And unfortunately, a family tragedy, the disappearance of one of the family's sons, nephew of Crandall and Myron, disappeared in 1971. I don't, how many of you remember Douglas Legg and the search? So it was quite tragic. In popular media, it came to define the family's time at Santanoni, which is, understandably, I think not something they wish to have be the defining theme of their time at Camp Santanoni. But at that point, when Douglas Legg disappeared, the Melvins had already been in discussion. So this was 1971, the Adirondack Park Agency and the Forest Preserve land use classifications this is all part of the era of that conversation and development. The Melvins had been in discussions about selling the camp to the Nature Conservancy. So they invited Thomas and Susan Pryne King, descendants of Robert and Anna Pryne. Susan Pryne King actually just recently passed away a year ago and is buried in Albany, along with Patrick Noonan, who is the head of the Nature Conservancy, to a conversation about the future of the property. And through public and private fundraising, the Adirondack chapter of the Nature Conservancy raised enough money to purchase the 12,900 acres. And then it went from the Nature Conservancy directly passed over to New York State. So then on February 18th, 1972, the state becomes the 4th owner of the property. It's added to the Forest Preserve. The DEC commissioner at the time was, the state was acquiring all this land. It had buildings. Those buildings didn't comply with the Forever Wild principle. What are they going to do with the buildings? The Melvins and the Pryne family took a lot of the items that you might have seen in those earlier pictures, the furnishings and the personal family items. And as I said, Some of them are now at the Adirondack Experience Museum. The road into the main camp, which had been private and closed to the public, remained so, but the buildings began deteriorating. And at the time, the DEC had a plan for the preserve that included 1,500 acres. So out of the almost 13,000, they were going to have 1,500 as a special purpose area, which included a 500-foot buffer zone on either side of the Newcomb Lake Road. And it was going to be a DEC training center, a public place for public visits, storage supplies for the training center, housing in the Gate Lodge, and the West Cottage, which you'll see in a minute. And of course, they're also acquiring other properties. Some of you may have been to Great Camp Sagamore in Racket Lake, which is another one. So during all of this, one of our founders, a man named Howie Kirschenbaum, got the Preservation League of New York State, where he used to work, which had been founded. It was by then. It was founded in 1974, involved in trying to figure out what to do with all of these historic buildings that the state owned. And this is where you'll start to see AARCH coming in and this theme of architecture and preservation. So there was a conference in 1978 to figure out what to do with buildings that the state was acquiring. Ultimately, so there was Camp Topridge, which some of you may have heard of. It was recently in the news. It's now privately owned. Great Camp Santanoni, Great Camp Sagamore, and Nahasni, which was on Lake Lila. Though they all became acquired by the state, they all have separate outcomes. So Nahasni was taken down. Great Camp Sagamore is owned by a private nonprofit educational organization and is open to the public. Topridge is private, and Great Camp Great Camp Santanoni remains standing, owned by the people of New York State and with support from AARCH. So you can see the farm kind of starts deteriorating. You can start to see more trees coming up. This is that dairy building behind there. Some greater attention starts to come to the great camps. Trees start growing and encroaching on the buildings. That's the farm complex, which had been all cleared land. There's the barn. And then in 1990, AARCH is formed. And a year later, it's determined that Great Camp Santanoni will be preserved. And in 1991, AARCH begins working with the town of Newcomb, begins undertaking a lot of repair work, including a visitor survey that 98.4% of visitors to Camp Santanoni said that the buildings and their history enhanced their experience of the wilderness. We also, AARCH started in cooperation with the town of Newcomb, an annual intern program, teaching young people hands-on preservation skills. They lead daily tours out at the main camp. We did a lot of hands-on work rebuilding the deteriorated porch, which basically the floor was gone on the porch. And then by 2000, Camp Santanoni became a historic area. It had its own unit management plan, and it became a National Historic Landmark. And that was really a watershed moment for the Great Camp. Here's some pictures of the barn and the fire, which was in 2004. And then there's a picture that you can see of the stanchions for the cows, and that wooden roof structure was really built to protect the stone walls that are underneath it, which were the foundation for that barn. 3 years ago, we completed a major capital project to put a new roof on the main camp and the Gate Lodge. And we continue to do repair work at Camp Santanoni. We have a farm tour. We also are looking to interpret beyond the main camp. So now we have regular farm tours. Here's some pictures of some models that are at the farm. That's another picture. Here's you can see the farm manager's cottage in the distance. This is the West Cottage, a building you see as you walk from the parking lot to the trailhead. It's one of those buildings that predates Robert and Anna Prine's purchase of the property. And we believe it was moved to this location. It once had a porch, and in the 1970s, the state removed it. So we're looking to restore it and create an accessible visitor center is on our wish list down the road. And we also are doing more interpretation of the Gate Lodge, which you see here. And so you can see there is this drive that loops around still, but on the other side of that arch, the road just goes straight up that hill. So as I said, that was kind of a whirlwind about Santanoni, and I want to talk about all the other things we do in our remaining time, because we do so much else too. But Santanoni is fun, and I knew this was a historic audience interested in historic architecture, so I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive. So our educational tour programs that we do as one of our other pillars of work alongside stewarding and interpreting Camp Santanoni. We offer about 30 educational tours and workshops each year. This is one of ours. It's called Small Farms Rising, and this is a tour of a farm in Keysville on Mace Chasm Road. We also tour historic great camps. So this is Moss Ledge, designed by William Coulter on Upper Saranac Lake. You can see some similarities to Camp Santanoni there, some differences. You can see for example, the bark is still on the logs. And also last year we went to Santa's workshop in Wilmington. So it really ranges the gamut from touring small farms and talking about the region's agricultural history to the great camps to sites like Santa's workshop and 20th century tourism sites. I mentioned our hands-on technical workshops. Here's our window workshop that we held last summer at the Sable Valley Grange Hall, which is right next door to our office in Keysville. We also, for the last few years, have had a preserving historic plaster workshop. We're going to have both of these workshops again this summer, and the window workshop will be in Croghan this year. And we have a plumbing workshop this year, which is new, which will be at the Adirondack Experience Museum. I thought I'd show this of your St. Lawrence County Courthouse, and here's a beautiful house, historic house in Malone. We work on National Register nominations throughout our service area, and this is just a few that we've completed in the last year. And in addition to National Register nominations, and those are projects really undertaken by Christine Bush, we also offer technical assistance, help finding funding for preservation projects. And we hold webinars, which is a relatively new thing that we started doing in the off-season months. So these are two webinars, our 2024 webinars. We just had the conversation with Dr. Green about Port Henry's 20th century African-American community and the Great Migration to Port Henry and to the North Country as African-Americans left the South to come north in the early and mid 20th century. Later this month, we're going to have a program about exploring architectural salvage featuring the executive directors of Historic Albany Foundation and Historic Ithaca, both colleague nonprofits that have architectural salvage warehouses. We celebrate excellence in preservation, and this is 2 years ago's Preservation Awards and annual meeting. This is in Hudson Falls on the border with Glens Falls across the river. And then we work with communities on supporting local advocacy projects. So this is the Thomas Memorial AME Zion Church in Watertown. And this is a very cool church. And if you, I don't know if the Watertown paper makes it up here or not, but I think it's the Free Press. Is that what it's called? No, Watertown Daily Times. Thank you. The Watertown Daily Times, and that was Plattsburgh. The Watertown Daily Times has done a lot of articles about Thomas Memorial. which was built in 1909 by congregants and who formed the concrete blocks that make up that form the church itself. And it's been vacant for for about 15 years. And we're working with the woman standing here and architect Randy Crawford, who some of you might know, and Neighbors of Watertown, housing nonprofit, on efforts, and the Preservation League of New York State to restore the church and to stabilize the tower. So AARCH is serving as a fiscal sponsor for a grant to do some basic stabilization work here. Another one of our advocacy projects is this church in Churubusco, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which was started in 1888, finished in 1891, built by African-American Mason Isaac Johnson, and was a congregation for many, many decades, and is now sitting vacant and in a little bit of limbo. And we're hoping to highlight this more this year. And then the steamboat Tuscarora, which is here you can see where it is now. It's been on land for for about 90 years now. We're also working with local advocates in Blue Mountain Lake to restore and interpret this historic steamboat so that we can relocate it from its current site, which is really somebody's yard in Blue Mountain Lake, to a more appropriate public site so that people can learn about transportation network of the early 20th century. And really, the steamboat Tuscarora is one of the rare survivors of the many steamboats that existed from the mid-1800s into the 20th centuries. And these steamboats operated throughout the Adirondacks on the Fulton chain of lakes, in Scroon Lake, Saranac Lakes, and then, of course, Blue Mountain Lake here and its associated waterways. It was built by A.C. Brown of Staten Island in the spring of 1900, and Brown's shop in Staten Island built other similar double-decker steamers, but this is really the lone surviving one. And this was the way to get into this very remote corner of the Adirondacks. The New York Central and Adirondack Railroads brought people to Old Forge and to North Creek, respectively. And from there, they took the small steamboats and coaches and wagons to get into the heart of the Adirondacks. So you can see the Tuscarora's role here was from Racket Lake into Blue Mountain Lake. There'd be you'd get on a boat, you'd get off the train, you get on the boat in Racket Lake, then there is a Marion River Carry single gauge railroad that would take people across that portage into the lakes that go into Blue Mountain Lake, and the Tuscarora would meet people there. And if you go to the Adirondack Experience and you in the pavilion, there's a great little interactive exhibit that's fairly historic itself now, where you push the button and like there's the boat in Racket Lake, and then it takes you to the little railroad, and then you can see the Tuscarora. It's very fun. So we are delighted to be supporting that effort. Another one of our efforts, which I don't have too much time to talk a lot about, is DeBar Pond Lodge. How many of you are familiar with DeBar Pond Lodge? So this is another historic great camp, but built in 1940, so a bit younger, in the DeBar Mountain Wild Forest. It's another historic building in the Adirondack Forest Preserve in the town of Duane. And this is kind of a sense of where it is. This picture was from a presentation I gave to people less familiar with the Adirondacks than you all. But here you can kind of see from the main road how, from the parking lot getting into where the lodge is and DeBar Pond, which is a beautiful site. And when you get to the complex, you're greeted by some outbuildings and this vista down to DeBar Pond. The main lodge was built in 1940 and designed by Saranac Lake architect William Diston. William Diston worked with Adirondack architect William Coulter, who designed that Moss Ledge great camp that I showed you a few slides ago. The owners of this site hired William Diston to build DeBar Pond Lodge. And at the time it was known as the Red Gate Farm. And here you go. William Diston also worked with the Hochschilds of Blue Mountain Lake to build their camp. And here's some pictures of DeBar Pond Lodge. We have been advocating for its preservation because it's part of the Forest Preserve. And there's some question about what to do with it. Until January, we had been supporting a land exchange amendment to take it out of the Forest Preserve so it could be operated by a nonprofit. Right now, that amendment is kind of off the table now. So we're working with the state to see what we can do to find a constitutionally appropriate reuse for the building so that it can remain there. And here's just some fun pictures of the interior. And this is what it looks like today. It looks bad because it's boarded up, but I've been inside and the inside is actually in good condition. The boards are protecting the interiors because they're protecting the windows, which are all still intact. Here's a nice image of it. And then I'm going to close by talking about the project, our latest program, which is our Adirondack Rural Revitalization Program. And that is something that this historical association is a beneficiary of. It is a brand new program of AARCH, and it's a single, right now it's a one-shot grant program funded by the National Park Service through their Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grant Program. This is a grant program for us to make regrants, subgrants to owners of historic buildings throughout our service area to encourage investment and community development and stabilization and keep people in their existing and historic buildings throughout our service region, contributing to community character, maintaining preservation standards, and creating economic development through supporting the town halls and nonprofits and libraries and Grange halls that make the center of our downtowns in this region. So you see here, there's the Keysville Civic Center, which is the old high school in Keysville. That's one of our grantees. This is a barn at Echo Farm in Essex, and that's the Wadhams Grange Hall. And these are the remaining of our grant recipients. You'll recognize one of the buildings at least. But we also funded a roof project, looking over at the top left, the Harrietstown Town Hall in Saranac Lake. And then I'm working kind of down. The blue building house below it is the Trudeau building, also in Saranac Lake, which is a project of Historic Saranac Lake. Then you see the Lake Pleasant Historical Society next to the Trudeau building, which is getting foundation work funded. And then above that is the Factory Schoolhouse in the community of Bleecker in Fulton County. Then skipping over, you of course see the Silas Wright House and the wonderful window restoration project that the Historical Association will be undertaking. This sweet stone building next to it is the Heinzelman Library in Brant Lake, which also is doing window repair and systems projects. Then you've got the historic Salem Courthouse down here, which is having restoration of its Great Hall. And then we're ending also in Washington County with Fort Anne. That's the old Stonehouse Library in Fort Anne, which is also the home of the Historical Society. So lots of historical societies and nonprofits and town-owned buildings getting important investment and preserving their buildings. And this is a picture of our last summer's plaster repair workshop attendees in front of the Graves Mansion in Ausable Forks, which has been the host of our plaster workshop. And if you're ever have occasion to drive through the Forks on 9N, I don't know why you would, but if you ever do, it's worth a detour to see the Graves Mansion. It is a great, you can't go in, it's privately owned, but just driving by, you'll probably understand why they could continue to host our plaster workshop for years to come. And it's a fantastic site with incredible woodwork. And it'll be there again this summer. So if you want to come join us and learn historic plaster repair, you get to spend 2 days inside this fantastic private vacant historic mansion. And that is the end of my talk. Any questions? Yes.
To what extent are you involved with fire tower preservation and restoration?
I'm so glad you asked that, and because we are involved, and I could have, I kind of just gave the skimming the surface of a lot of what we do. We were deeply involved in fire tower preservation around the same time in developing this historic area land use classification, which allowed the fire towers to remain in the forest preserve places like Hurricane Mountain and others. And we had stewarded several friends groups, just like we're acting as a fiscal sponsor for that Friends of Tuscarora and the Friends of Thomas Memorial, AME Zion and Watertown. We've served as the fiscal sponsor for fire tower friends groups. And we also sponsored the National Register nominations for many of the fire towers. There's a document, kind of an overarching document for Adirondack fire towers to talk about why they're historic and should be designated as such. So we currently are the sponsor of 2 fire tower friends groups, the Friends of Hurricane Mountain and the Friends of Poca Moonshine. And Friends of Poca Moonshine, we have a part-time staff person who operates very independently, who coordinates the Friends of Poco and that friends group. And on our website and on our YouTube channel, just like the Historical Association has a YouTube channel, so do we. And David Thomas Train, who's the coordinator. Do you know David?
I do.
Okay, so David gave a talk for us when I first started 2 years ago on fire towers, and that can be found on our YouTube channel. And he goes into the history of the fire towers and in some detail on the Poco fire tower. Thanks. Other questions? Yes.
The name Santanoni.
Yes. We don't, so there's a mountain, one of the high peaks is Santanoni. The mountain came first and was named first. The Great Camp is named after the mountain. And we don't know. There's a lot of different stories about what, some say, that it was kind of a blur of St. Anthony from some of the Italian immigrants that came to the region. Some say it's a kind of interpretation of a Native American or indigenous word. It's unclear where Santanoni comes from. We don't have really good provenance on the name itself. But if you're walking in this time of year, when the leaves are off the trees, when you're most of the way into the main camp, so let's say you're about 3.5 miles in or 4 miles in on that 5-mile road, you can see the mountain Santanoni off in the distance. There's only really one spot on that road that you get a good view of the mountain. So you can see why she was named after the mountain.
We have a question in chat from Abby. She asked if you're involved in anything with the great camps that are currently in use in private ownership, for example, Colgate Camp or the Camarera/Food Camp, or are they responsible for their own projects and maintenance?
So privately owned great camps, just like all privately owned buildings, the private property owners are responsible for their own upkeep and maintenance and repair and restoration projects. We serve to provide technical assistance to property owners of all types, historic, private property owners, nonprofits, municipalities. So we will work with private camp owners on helping them, and this is also something that Christine does, help providing technical services, helping them find a good contractor, putting their camp on the National Register if they would like to have it historically designated and honored in that way, which also can open up some sources of funding. So Camp Veery is a private great camp in Big Moose that we wrote, Christine wrote the National Register nomination for. So we do, and then through our tours, which Nolan does, we will visit private great camps, which again help bring attention to them and their history and their architecture. Yes, Chris.
Would come by the organization, like Old University or Cambridge University, would they potentially be eligible for the grant program, the Rural Revitalization Program?
They would have, yes. Our program was really meant to focus on the hamlets. So it, or agricultural buildings. So we did they would have had to make a case for kind of their contribution to this. What we wanted to do was encourage community investment and stability for the hamlets and community centers inside of the region. But they can qualify for other sources of funding if they're owned by a nonprofit, especially if they're on the National Register. The National Register of Historic Places is really a purely honorary designation. You can have a building on the National Register and paint it pink polka dots, put on an addition if you want to, if it complies with local zoning. You can even demolish your building that's on the National Register as long as you use private funds. So it's all about private property rights, and private property owners using private funds can do what they wish to their National Register listed buildings. But it does open up a lot of opportunities for different grant programs like ours. You had to be on the National Register, for historic tax credits for building owners, and other sources of funding. But in preservation, regulations are really at the local level. So people who think of, oh, if it's historically listed or landmarked, I'm going to be told what I have to do. That's only if your local government has that program. It's not the National Register. So that's something that we always try to underscore. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, Erin. This has been great.
Thank you.